She walked into the courtroom in handcuffs, just another name on a docket. No one noticed the tattered military coat hanging off her shoulders. No one asked why her eyes looked like they'd seen more than most would dare. Just another homeless black woman facing charges for trespassing behind a cafe for trying to stay warm. But when she spoke her name, Staff Sergeant Monica Carter, United States Marine Corps, everything stopped. And when the judge looked up and recognized that name, the entire courtroom would never be the same. This is not just a story about injustice. It's about memory, about how a country forgets its own, until one woman refuses to be forgotten. Her name was nearly erased, but what she did next would leave a legacy that echoed through history. Under the gray morning light seeping through the courthouse windows, the air in courtroom 7B felt as cold and indifferent as the concrete walls that surrounded it. People chatted absently, flipping through legal briefs and sipping lukewarm coffee from foam cups, unaware that history had just walked in, shackled and silent. At first glance, no one paid much attention to her. She moved like a shadow stooped under a tattered military-issued coat, far too large for her slight frame, hands cuffed loosely at the front, her wrists bruised from winters spent without gloves, and the indifferent grip of too many officers. Her skin, once vibrant and deep bronze, was now dulled by time, hardship and exposure to the unforgiving streets of Newbridge. Her hair, tucked beneath a woolen cap, fraying at the edges, was streaked with gray that revealed not just age, but a lifetime of burdens carried with quiet dignity. She shuffled forward as instructed by the bailiff, eyes cast downward. "State your name for the record," the clerk said, barely glancing up from her clipboard. There was a pause, the kind of pause that seems too long for such a simple question. Then a voice, gravelly hesitant, yet carrying a strange resonance, rose from beneath that coat. "Monica Carter," she said, "Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps." That sentence, seemingly unremarkable in a room where hundreds of names were uttered each week, sent a silent ripple through the air, but no one noticed. No one except the judge. Across the room, Judge Olivia Parker had been flipping through the case file with routine efficiency until that moment. But when her eyes landed on the name printed across the top of the defendant's profile, her hand froze mid-page. Her breath caught. Time seemed to hesitate. Monica Carter. She whispered the name silently to herself, and for a fleeting second, the polished, composed figure of the judge disappeared, replaced by a young woman, standing on the tarmac of a military base 2 decades earlier, waving goodbye to her brother as he boarded a C-130 bound for Iraq. Lieutenant Jack Parker. That name, Monica Carter, had once been spoken with reverence in her family home. It belonged to the Marine who had carried her brother from the firefight in Fallujah, the Marine who had vanished before anyone could properly thank her. Now that name reappeared in front of her as a defendant in a municipal court, charged with disturbing the peace trespassing and resisting arrest. She looked up slowly, examining the woman standing across the courtroom. Could it really be the same person? This hunched, worn figure who looked more like a survivor of a forgotten war with no medals, no banner, no country willing to remember her service. But Olivia knew eyes didn't lie. And though Monica kept hers low, half-hidden beneath a frayed brim, there was something in the tilt of her jaw and the way she carried herself that stirred something long buried. The clerk resumed her routine. Case number 47B, City of Newbridge versus Monica Carter. The prosecutor stood young and polished his voice smooth and confident. "Your Honor, the defendant has been cited 3 times in the past month for loitering behind Jefferson Street Cafe. She's been warned, fined, and removed by law enforcement. This time, she refused to vacate when ordered." Monica did not react. She stood motionless, her face unreadable, her hands twitching slightly in their restraints. The prosecutor continued. "We request a 30-day community service sentence and a no trespass order for the downtown area." Judge Parker didn't speak immediately. Her fingers drummed once on the file. "Does the defendant have legal representation today?" she asked. Monica shook her head. "Public defender got called to another courtroom, ma'am," she said simply. "Would you like to speak on your own behalf?" Olivia's voice softened almost imperceptibly. Monica cleared her throat. "No excuses, Your Honor," she said, words barely above a whisper. "Just needed to stay warm. That spot by the cafe, it's got a vent. Jimmy leaves food sometimes. His father served with me. Desert Storm." The room was silent. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Olivia's face remained unreadable. She glanced back down at the file, and something caught her eye. The years of service, the deployments 1979 to 2005, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Staff Sergeant. She frowned slightly. Your service record indicates you were awarded the Silver Star, she said, veering off the legal script. Monica nodded faintly. That was a long time ago, ma'am. Fallujah. April 2004. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Olivia's voice dropped just enough to signal she wasn't asking for the court record. She was asking for herself. Monica stiffened. Her head rose for the first time, eyes locking onto the judge's. Yes, ma'am, she said slowly. That convoy was ambushed. We lost good people that day. Olivia's eyes narrowed, absorbing every detail. But before she could say anything further, the courtroom doors opened. A man in a navy suit, tall and composed, stepped inside and walked briskly to the defense table. Your Honor, he said, Alexander Ross. I've just been retained to represent Miss Carter. The judge blinked. This is highly irregular, Mr. Ross. I understand, Your Honor. It was a last-minute development. I respectfully request a brief recess to confer with my client. Olivia stared at him, then at Monica. Her instincts as a judge, her decades of discipline, told her to question everything. But her gut, something deeper, something human, told her this wasn't coincidence. It was destiny. 15-minute recess, she announced, her voice steady. This court is in recess. As she rose and walked toward her chambers, she dared not look back at Monica. Not yet. Not until she was sure. Behind closed doors, Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled as she removed her glasses and reached for the drawer in her desk. From within it, she pulled out a photograph worn at the edges, bent in the corners. In it, a young Marine in dress blues stood tall beside her, his arm draped across her shoulders. Her brother, Jack. And next to the photo, an old envelope. The last letter he had sent before he died. She read the line she had memorized 2 decades ago. There's a woman in my unit, Staff Sergeant Carter. She dragged me out of the fire literally. Wouldn't leave me even when I ordered her to. She says no Marine gets left behind, not while she's still breathing. Olivia's eyes welled. Her mind raced. The court record had called her a vagrant, a nuisance. But she wasn't that. She was the reason Olivia's family had had 2 extra weeks with Jack. 2 final phone calls. 1 more smile. And now this woman stood in her courtroom, forgotten by the system she had served, reduced to a docket number. Olivia rose and made a call. The past was about to collide with the present in a way no one in that courtroom could have predicted, and justice long overdue had just begun to stir. The silence in Judge Parker's chambers was shattered only by the faint hum of the courthouse HVAC system, a constant background drone that now seemed thunderous in the thick private air of reflection. Olivia stood motionless for a long time. After ending the call, her hand still clutching the receiver like it was a lifeline to everything she'd tried to bury beneath her professional veneer. Duty, honor, grief, guilt. Her eyes, red but resolute, flicked back to the photograph of her brother and the letter that had weathered 2 decades of folded corners and tear stains. Somewhere beyond the walls of her chamber, Monica Carter, the woman no one saw, no one remembered, was sitting in a plastic chair, likely wondering why the world had suddenly tilted so unexpectedly in her direction. In the adjacent consultation room, Ross sat across from Monica, speaking in the hushed, purposeful tones of a man who didn't waste time with disbelief. Ma'am, he said gently but directly, you don't know me, but I've known Judge Parker's family my whole life. Her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, was my best friend. I was at his funeral. I remember your name from the letters he wrote. He always said there was a staff sergeant who saved his life, a woman he looked up to more than anyone. That was you, wasn't it? Monica stared at him, unsure whether to respond or simply walk away. Her eyes were wary guarded, like someone who'd learned the hard way not to trust anyone who smiled too easily. I don't know what you want, she said flatly. But if this is pity, it's not Ross cut in softly. It's justice. It's time. Monica looked away, her gaze finding a crack in the plaster wall, as if it might lead her back to any moment in life when she'd been more than just a statistic. Her mind drifted back involuntarily to Fallujah, to the scorching air that tasted like ash and metal, to the screams of men half her age calling for help, and to the moment she saw a young officer, Jack, bleeding out behind a broken Humvee. She hadn't hesitated. That's what the Corps taught her, move, act, protect. She remembered dragging him across sand and shrapnel, shielding his body with hers, telling him again and again, "You're not dying today, Lieutenant." And when they finally got him on the medevac chopper, she'd looked into his face and seen the disbelief. How could someone like her, a woman, a black Marine, low-ranking and scarred, be the one to save the Golden Boy officer? But he had squeezed her hand and whispered, "Thank you," with such clarity it still echoed in her bones. And then he was gone, and weeks later, she heard he was dead. An IED. Nothing she did could change that. Her life unraveled quietly after that. The war never left her, not when she was discharged for injuries she couldn't name, and not when the VA lost her paperwork. Her medals vanished in a storage auction when she couldn't pay the fee. Her husband left her with a 3-sentence note taped to an empty refrigerator. Then came the shelters, the cold, the judgmental stares, and the daily humiliation of being invisible unless someone wanted her to move along. Ma'am Ross's voice brought her back. "Judge Parker knows," she remembers. "That's why I'm here." Monica scoffed lightly. "And what's she gonna do? Give me a handshake and send me back out into the snow?" "No," Ross said, leaning forward. "She's going to hear you, really hear you. For the first time in 2 decades. Monica shook her head. "I'm tired, Mr. Ross. I'm too tired for false hope." "Then let me carry it for a while," he said, "just until we walk out of that courtroom." Meanwhile, in her chambers, Olivia was preparing herself with the precision of a woman rearming after 20 years of silence. She looked in the mirror and saw not just the judge, but the sister who had spent 2 decades wondering whether her brother had died alone. Now she knew he hadn't. He had died knowing someone was willing to die for him. That mattered. It changed everything. When the courtroom reconvened, something had shifted. The air felt charged like the moments before a storm breaks. Olivia returned to the bench, her gavel resting silently beside her as she adjusted her papers with hands that still trembled slightly. Ross rose first. "Your Honor," he said with practiced calm, "my client wishes to request a dismissal of all charges. We can provide witness testimony and evidence that she was not trespassing, but simply surviving. Restaurant employees have confirmed that she was not interfering with operations, and that she has never caused any disturbances." The prosecutor started to object, but Olivia raised a hand. "I have questions for the defendant," she said, her voice calm, but edged with something electric. She turned to Monica. "Your service file indicates you were stationed in Fallujah in April 2004. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Is that correct?" Monica's posture shifted. Her spine, though, weary, straightened by instinct. "Yes, ma'am," she replied. "Were you present during the ambush on the western perimeter of the city, escorting a supply convoy?" A flicker of surprise passed over Monica's face. She hadn't expected this. "Yes," she said slowly. "We were ambushed. They hit us hard. Took out the lead Humvee. We were pinned. I was assigned rear guard. Saw a young lieutenant take a round dragging someone out of the kill zone. I went after him." "Lieutenant Jack Parker?" Olivia said, barely above a whisper. The name hit Monica like a memory detonated. She stared at the judge. Now really stared as recognition began to crystallize. "He kept shouting at me to leave him," Monica said quietly, her voice dry. "But I didn't. We got him on the bird. I heard he made it to Germany." "He did," Olivia replied. 2 weeks later, his vehicle hit an IED. A hush fell so thick that even the creak of the courtroom chairs seemed too loud. In the gallery, a silver-haired man in a Marine League jacket stood suddenly. "That's her," he said. "That's Staff Sergeant Monica Carter. She saved 6 of us that day. I was there. We all saw it." "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, "while Ms. Carter's military service is honorable, it is not relevant to." "The court disagrees," Olivia cut in sharply. "It is deeply relevant. It speaks to character. It speaks to sacrifice. It speaks to a promise this country made and failed to keep." She paused, her voice trembling for the first time. "And to someone we owe more than just words." Then she stood, not as a judge, but as a sister, as a citizen, as someone who had spent 20 years trying to find the person who gave her family one more goodbye. "Before we proceed," she said, "I have something personal to share with the court." Gasps rose around the room as she addressed Monica directly. "Lieutenant Jack Parker was my brother." Monica's mouth parted slightly, her expression folding into disbelief and pain. "I tried to find you for years," Olivia continued, "but I was told you redeployed. then discharged. No one knew where you went. No one told me you had fallen through the cracks." Monica swallowed hard. "I didn't fall," she said. "I was pushed." Olivia nodded slowly. "And we let you fall." Behind her, the courtroom doors opened again. 3 uniformed Marines entered, one colonel, a master sergeant, and a young corporal, carrying a polished wooden case. The colonel stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant Monica J. Carter," he said formally, "by order of the Secretary of the Navy, in recognition of extraordinary bravery and selfless service, on April 17, 2004, the United States Marine Corps hereby awards you the Navy Cross." The young corporal opened the case, revealing the medal, resting on deep blue velvet. A collective breath was held. The second highest military honor. Monica stared at it, unable to speak, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Your Silver Star has been formally upgraded," the colonel added. "Your actions didn't just save Lieutenant Parker, they disrupted an ambush that would have decimated our entire convoy. We've been trying to find you for years to correct this oversight." Monica's lips trembled. "There must be a mistake," she murmured. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Olivia said. "You did what heroes do." From the back of the room, the Marine League veteran raised his hand. "Attention on deck," he shouted, and one by one, the room rose. Veterans, civilians, court staff, even the prosecutor, standing in solemn salute to the woman who had walked in invisible and now stood seen. Monica Carter's hands trembled as she reached out and accepted the medal. For the first time in decades, someone had remembered. Someone had come looking. And maybe, just maybe, that meant she could finally stop surviving and start living. The weight of the medal in Monica's hand felt heavier than she ever could have imagined, not because of the silver or the velvet box it came in, but because of what it represented: a past she had been forced to forget, a self she had buried beneath layers of rejection, bureaucratic silence, and winter nights curled against steam vents with newspapers stuffed into her coat sleeves. As the courtroom slowly settled from the thunderous silence of the standing salute, Monica stood with her shoulders still squared, not out of pride, not yet, but out of instinct, like the spine of a Marine who had never truly left the battlefield. Judge Olivia Parker remained standing behind the bench, watching the woman she had long imagined in vague memories of sandstorms and folded flags now transformed into something fully real, fragile, strong, forgotten, remembered. In light of these developments, Olivia said, her voice wavering only slightly, "All charges against Staff Sergeant Monica Carter are hereby dismissed." The gavel came down not as a mechanical punctuation mark to a legal proceeding, but like a thunderclap cracking open the heavens. This courtroom is adjourned. But no one moved. The atmosphere had changed. No longer a room of prosecutors and defense attorneys, clerks and defendants. It had become a sacred space, a battlefield, where justice was finally ambushed by grace. The Marines who had accompanied Colonel Matthews stepped forward again, this time with another document. Monica's corrected VA record, her disability rating reassessed to 100% retroactively applied to her original discharge date, along with full medical coverage, housing assistance, education benefits, and all support, entitled to a veteran who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Ross read the paper over her shoulder as she tried to make sense of it all, the words swimming on the page like some foreign language of hope she hadn't spoken in years. "This means," he explained quietly, "you're not only going to get what you were owed all along, you're getting it back. All of it, every cent, every benefit, with interest." Monica blinked, disoriented. "How much are we talking?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ross turned the page, eyebrows raised slightly. "Well into 6 figures, he said. "Maybe more, depending on how far back they can document your injuries and appeal delays. It's substantial." Monica stared at the paper like it might evaporate. "You're telling me that after 20 years of being told I don't exist, I suddenly matter?" Again, Ross didn't smile, but his voice was gentle. "I'm telling you, the country's trying to make it right, even if it's 2 decades late." Just then, another figure emerged from the gallery, a young man in a cook's apron, wringing his hands and stepping slowly forward. It was Jimmy the cook from the Jefferson Street Cafe. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly, I didn't know. I mean, my dad always told me stories about a Marine named Carter. He said if I ever met her, I owed her everything. He used to call you the angel who ran into gunfire." Monica's mouth opened, but no words came out. Jimmy extended a hand. I just thought you were someone who needed a sandwich. I didn't know you were her. Monica reached out her fingers, closing over his in a handshake that carried more weight than any salute. Thank you, she said simply. And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like a century, someone had spoken to her like she wasn't invisible. As the courtroom began to empty, whispers floated like incense. She was behind the cafe every night. How could we not have known? But Monica wasn't listening. She was still standing in the same spot, gripping the metal with one hand and the document folder with the other, her thoughts spinning wildly between disbelief, grief, and something resembling vindication. Olivia descended from the bench, walking around it for the first time since her appointment, to meet a defendant not as a judge, but as a sister in mourning. She stood in front of Monica, no longer towering above her on the dais, no longer draped in judicial authority, just Olivia, the younger sister of the boy Monica had saved with her own body. Jack told us what you said to him, she said softly. You told him, no Marine gets left behind, not while I'm still breathing. Monica's eyes shone. That was the rule, she said, not just in the Corps, in life. You don't walk away from people who need you. Olivia nodded slowly, the weight of 20 years breaking across her like a tide. We walked away from you, she said, and I'm sorry. It's not your fault, Monica replied. It's just how the system's built. We all get filtered through it. Some people come out whole, others get stuck in the pipes. Olivia's lips curled into a tired, understanding smile. Not anymore. Not you. 2 weeks later, Monica stood in front of a full-length mirror in a small apartment provided through a veterans housing initiative that Olivia had spearheaded years earlier, never knowing it was for Monica. The walls were clean, but bare, save for a single frame now hanging above her modest kitchen table. Inside it was the Navy Cross flanked by the Purple Heart and her Silver Star. All of them recovered by Ross's firm from a storage unit that had been sold when she defaulted on payments during her first winter of homelessness. They had tracked it all down, bidding records, photographs, storage facility archives, and reclaimed every lost piece of her honor like archaeologists recovering artifacts from a buried temple. Monica reached up and adjusted the metals, slightly ensuring the Navy Cross sat perfectly centered, then stepped back and regarded her reflection. Her hair was washed, pulled back in a neat bun. Her clothes were simple but new. Her eyes, though still marked by time, no longer bore the weary cloud of invisibility. She was here, whole, remembered. A knock at the door made her jump. She opened it to find Olivia standing there, not in robes, not as a judge, just as herself, holding a box wrapped in weathered brown paper and string. May I come in? She asked. Monica nodded. Just Monica now, she said. Then it's just, Olivia came the warm reply. They sat together at the table, the box between them. I found these, Olivia said, opening the lid to reveal a bundle of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. They're Jack's. He wrote them every week during deployment. We kept them all. This one, she added, pulling a single envelope free, he wrote the day after you saved him. Monica's hands shook slightly as she unfolded the page. The handwriting was sharp, clear, familiar, in a way that made her throat tighten. She read it aloud. Mom, Dad. I'm okay. I'm alive. Staff Sergeant Carter pulled me out of a death trap yesterday. I don't know how she did it. She just moved like she didn't even see the bullets. I tried to stop her, but she said, not on my watch. If I ever become half the leader she is, I'll consider myself lucky. Monica stopped blinking fast, her breath hitching in her chest. Olivia placed a hand over hers. He looked up to you, she said. You were the reason he still believed in the Corps. In people. Monica looked around the room, at the frame, at the sunlight, creeping through the window, and finally back at Olivia. I used to think saving him was a mistake, that I bought him 2 weeks of borrowed time just so he could die anyway. But now, hearing this, maybe I didn't fail him after all. You didn't, Olivia said gently. You gave him something we never could time, a chance to call us, to say goodbye, to live like a hero, because one carried him out when no one else could. Monica's eyes welled again, but this time the tears were not bitter. They were cleansing. For years, she whispered, I thought no one remembered. I thought none of it mattered anymore. It did, Olivia said, to Jack, to every Marine you saved, to me. They sat in silence, two women bound by a single act of courage in a place far from here. Outside, snow had begun to fall soft, clean quiet, as if the world itself was trying to apologize. Monica stood and walked to the window, watching the flakes swirl in the wind, a slow smile forming on her lips. "Someone remembered my name," she murmured. "After all this time, someone remembered." Behind her, Olivia nodded. "And now, the whole world will." In that moment, something long broken inside Monica Carter began to heal, not with glory or fanfare, but with the simple, undeniable power of being seen, of being known, of being honored not as a number, not as a problem, but as a person whose sacrifices mattered. And for the first time in 2 decades, she believed that maybe she could breathe easy, not because she was still surviving, but because she had finally come home. Monica Carter stood by the frost-lined window of her small apartment, the snowfall outside blurring the city lights into soft halos of white and amber, as if the world was finally trying to quiet itself long enough for her to hear it breathe. Her hand rested gently on the window frame, warm fingers against cold glass, anchoring herself to this new strange sense of permanence. It had been years, no decades since she had called any place home. For most of that time, she had measured her life not in years or milestones, but in nights survived in steam vents located in cups of coffee offered with, or without judgment, in hours of sleep stolen before security guards barked her awake. And now, all at once, she had a door with a key, a heater that stayed on a name that carried meaning, and silence that was no longer suffocating. Behind her, the small room carried echoes of yesterday's breakthrough. Olivia's visit, the bundle of letters, Jack's handwriting, preserved like sacred scripture, and the metal on the wall that no longer felt foreign to her reflection. She had barely slept, and not because of fear, but because for the first time in years her mind was flooded not with ghosts, but with voices. Jack's laugh, Jimmy's wide eyes, Ross's quiet assurance, and Olivia's trembling words. "We walked away from you, and I'm sorry." That sentence still replayed in her head, not for its apology, but for its recognition. All her life, Monica had never needed people to save her. She had learned to do that herself. What she needed, though, was for someone to acknowledge that she had been fighting, that her strength had been real, that she hadn't imagined her worth. The sun hadn't yet risen when another knock came at the door, this one light but deliberate. Monica opened it to find Ross standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee and a file tucked under one arm. "You're up early," he said. Monica nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Didn't sleep," she admitted. "Too quiet." Ross handed her the coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. "That'll change. Quiet turns into peace if you let it." Monica raised an eyebrow. "That a lawyer's wisdom, or just something you read off a tea bag?" Ross smiled faintly. "A little of both." He tapped the file on the table. "I wanted to walk you through this. Your benefits package is being expedited. VA finally flagged your case as priority red, thanks to Colonel Matthews lighting a few fires." He opened the folder and slid it toward her. Pages and pages of figures, statements, signatures, government stamps, all detailing the life she was about to step into: housing security, monthly payments, retroactive disability, compensation, medical and mental health services, educational benefits, should she ever want to return to school job training programs for veterans, even an optional caregiver stipend if she needed help. It was overwhelming. "So, this is all mine?" she asked. "Every cent of it, every line." Monica stared down at the numbers, her hands trembling slightly. "I lived off $40 a week," she whispered. "Half of that went to socks and hand warmers. Now they want to give me a 6-figure check." "They don't want to give it," Ross said gently. "They owe it, and you're going to take it. Because you earned every dollar of it, in sand, in blood, in silence." Monica nodded slowly. "And what do I do now?" Ross tilted his head. "Whatever you want." That sentence echoed in the air for a long moment. No one had ever said that to her, not even as a child. "Whatever I want," she repeated as if trying on the words to see if they fit. "So, if I wanted to disappear, then I'd ask you not to," Ross said. "Because people are watching now. They've seen what's been done to you. And they care." "Do they?" she asked, skeptical. "Or is this just the hero of the week moment before I get shelved again?" Ross didn't flinch. "That depends. On you, on what you do with the voice you've earned. Because let me tell you, Sergeant Carter, right now, you're louder than you think." Monica stared into her coffee for a long beat. Then she said, "I don't want to disappear, but I don't want to be a symbol either. I want to be real, a person, a life, not just a file number someone stamped closed. Then live, Ross replied. We'll take care of the rest. That afternoon, Monica put on her only winter coat, the same military one that had once embarrassed her, and walked to the Jefferson Street Cafe. She hadn't returned since the trial. The street was quieter now, cleaner. She noticed how people looked at her differently, with recognition rather than suspicion. A few nodded. One woman offered her a shy smile. It made her heart ache. Inside the cafe, Jimmy was behind the counter pouring coffee for a group of construction workers. When he saw her, he froze, then broke into a huge grin. Monica, he called, rushing forward. You came back. I needed to, she said. I never said thank you properly, Jimmy shrugged. I should have done more. I didn't know who you were. You knew I was cold, she said. That was enough. He pulled out a chair and insisted she sit, bringing her a fresh sandwich and a slice of warm pie. On the house, he said, always. Around them, the cafe seemed to listen. People glanced over, whispering softly. Monica felt the old tension in her shoulders rise, ready for stares, for whispers of freeloader, or that's her. But what she heard was different. She's the one, right? The vet, the Marine from court. God, she looks so small. I can't believe she did all that. She saved lives. She had become a story, a living symbol. But this time, not of shame or rejection. This time of courage, of survival, of everything the system had tried to erase but failed. After lunch, Monica walked to the edge of the city park and stood beneath a bare tree, its branches clawing the pale sky. She closed her eyes, listened to the wind, to distant traffic, to children's laughter, and then from somewhere inside her chest, she heard something else, her own breath. Steady, full, unafraid. Later that week, she received a letter from the Department of Defense inviting her to speak at a veterans advocacy event in D.C. She nearly threw it away, but something stopped her. She picked up the phone, called the number listed, and said yes. Because sometimes healing meant going back into the world that hurt you and showing it who you still were, who you never stopped being. And so, for the first time in 20 years, Staff Sergeant Monica Carter packed a bag not for a shelter, not for survival, but for purpose, for the road ahead, for the life she was finally allowed to claim as her own. The air in Washington, D.C. felt sharper than Monica Carter expected, not because of the cold, though winter still clung to the sidewalks and monuments with stubborn ice, but because of the way the city seemed to buzz beneath the surface, so many lives moving quickly, urgently, like gears inside a massive machine that didn't notice the people it chewed up and spat out. She stood quietly near the steps of the National Veterans Hall, gripping the handle of a borrowed suitcase, and watching as other speakers, guests, and staff filed into the building with lanyards around their necks and badges that seemed to grant them access to a world she had never been invited to before. She was wearing a simple dark blue blazer that Ross had helped her pick out her first new jacket in nearly a decade, and a crisp white blouse that didn't quite feel like hers yet. But she wore it anyway, not because she wanted to look the part, but because she owed it to the story she was about to tell. Olivia had called her the night before, voice warm and steady, offering encouragement and promising to be in the front row. They need to hear it from you, Monica, she'd said. Not from policymakers or historians. From someone who lived it. Someone who still walks through it. Monica had hesitated then, as she was hesitating now, standing alone with the nerves crawling up her spine, like old ghosts trying to drag her back to silence. But then the doors opened and a uniformed officer smiled and beckoned her in, and the Marine inside her, the woman who had run through fire for her brothers, the one who had slept on cardboard without surrendering her dignity, took a breath and moved forward. The main hall was large, ornate, polished wood floors gleaming under chandeliers that looked like constellations frozen in motion. Rows of chairs stretched out in perfect order, facing a stage framed by the American flag, the Marine Corps banner, and a long table with name cards for panelists. Monica found her seat at the far end of the stage, her name printed neatly on a placard that looked so official, so permanent, it almost made her laugh. A woman who had been invisible now had a nameplate in a room full of generals and senators. As the event began, speakers took turns discussing policy changes, veteran outreach programs, and reformation of the VA claims system. Words like efficiency oversight and interagency collaboration floated through the air like clinical bandages wrapped around deep wounds. But it wasn't until Monica was introduced that the room shifted. Our next speaker, the moderator said, is someone who served with distinction in Iraq, was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary bravery, and who, until recently, was one of the many veterans our system failed to see. Please welcome Staff Sergeant Monica Carter. There was polite applause, but as Monica approached the podium, something changed. People leaned forward, conversations halted. And when she placed her hands on either side of the microphone and looked out over the crowd, her voice did not tremble. "Good morning," she said, her tone calm and deliberate. "I didn't come here to talk about medals or commendations. I came here to talk about what it means to be remembered and what it costs when you're not." The room fell silent. She took a breath. "I served 26 years in the United States Marine Corps. I did 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, and came home with a spinal injury, a brain injury, and a chest full of trauma no X-ray can capture. When I left the Corps, I didn't leave with a parade. I left with a folder of paperwork, most of it incomplete. The VA lost my file. My benefits were delayed indefinitely. My appeal was buried for over a decade. My medals were sold in a storage auction. I spent 15 years on the streets eating from church bins and hiding behind restaurants to stay warm. No one asked what happened to me. No one saw a veteran. They saw a problem." Murmurs rippled across the audience. Monica continued, "I didn't tell anyone who I was, because in this country you don't get to be both a war hero and homeless. People don't believe that can be true. They think if you serve someone, must be taking care of you. I'm here to tell you that's a lie. The truth is the system remembers your service when it wants to decorate a ceremony. It forgets you when you're in line at the shelter." Her voice grew firmer now. "But I was lucky. One day I found myself standing in front of a judge who recognized my name. Not because I was famous, but because I had saved her brother's life in Fallujah 20 years earlier. That judge didn't just hear my case. She heard my story. And for the first time in decades, someone saw me." The room was breathless. She paused, steadying herself. "I don't want pity. I don't need applause. I want accountability. I want change, because I am not the only one. There are thousands of veterans like me, still living in alleys, still trapped in broken systems, still waiting for someone to say, 'We remember you.'" She looked down briefly, then raised her eyes again, unwavering. "So, remember this. The cost of war doesn't end when the war does. It echoes through every VA office that loses a file, every landlord who refuses to rent to a vet, every shelter that turns away a woman in uniform. We earned more than a folded flag and a headstone. We earned a life, and it's time you gave it back." She stepped away from the podium as silence thundered across the hall. Then a single pair of hands began to clap, then more. Then the entire room rose. Generals, lawmakers, civilians. Every single person stood and applauded, not out of formality, but out of something deeper: recognition, gratitude, respect. As Monica sat down, Olivia met her gaze from the front row, eyes shining. Later that evening, after interviews and cameras and handshakes from people who once wouldn't have looked at her twice, Monica found herself standing on the steps outside the building alone once more. But this time, the air didn't bite so hard. The city didn't feel so far away. She looked up at the night sky stars veiled by city haze and whispered, "Jack! I hope I made you proud." And in the silence that followed, she felt something stir not just within her, but around her, as if the city itself had paused to listen. She was no longer surviving. She was leading, and tomorrow she would speak again. Not because someone invited her, but because her story mattered, because she mattered, because Monica Carter had finally been seen. The morning after the speech, Monica Carter awoke before dawn, not out of habit or survival instinct, but because her mind, no longer silenced by cold or shame, had begun to hum with something unfamiliar momentum. She sat on the edge of the neatly made bed in her modest hotel room, just blocks from the Capitol, still wearing the Navy Cross ribbon on her nightstand, like a talisman she couldn't quite bring herself to pack away. The speech had gone viral overnight. Ross had told her in a late-night call full of barely contained awe. "You broke something open, Monica. Social media's ablaze. Veterans are calling in from every state. The Secretary of Defense has already requested a private meeting. They're listening now." But Monica, ever the Marine, didn't let adrenaline carry her away. She simply said, "Good. Let's make sure they don't forget. She dressed slowly, carefully, not in her uniform, but in something that felt both dignified and true. A gray sweater over a plain white blouse, slacks that fit her properly. Boots she'd been gifted by a veteran-run nonprofit the day before. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't see the woman who had once huddled behind a cafe alley vent in the dead of winter. She saw a leader not because someone had handed her a microphone, but because she had earned the right to be heard, one scar, one humiliation, one survival at a time. Downstairs, a black car was waiting to take her to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Ross was already inside, sipping coffee folder, open on his lap. "You ready for this?" he asked. Monica gave him a half smile. They're the ones who need to be ready. When they arrived, they were met by an assistant secretary and a protocol officer who escorted them through security and up to a glass-walled conference room overlooking the National Mall. Inside, a dozen senior officials sat with folders labeled Carter Testimony in front of them. For a moment, Monica hesitated, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. This was the same department that had lost her records, that had denied her appeals, that had watched her vanish into homelessness without so much as a follow-up call. And now they were waiting to hear her speak. She stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, and took her seat at the head of the table. "Thank you for being here," Staff Sergeant said, one of the men, voice smooth, rehearsed. "We'd like to begin by formally apologizing for the failures you endured. Your case is a sobering reminder of the work still ahead." Monica nodded, but didn't reply immediately. She opened her own folder, not with printed talking points, but with letters she had received in just the last 12 hours. Handwritten, typed, scanned, emailed, from veterans, from widows, from children of the forgotten. "Before we talk about me," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade through fog, "I want to read you something." She pulled out a note scribbled on a torn napkin from an Arkansas diner. "My husband served in Vietnam. Took his life, waiting for his benefits to be approved. They came through 6 weeks after the funeral. Another, my mother was a Navy nurse. She died of cancer in a shelter. The hospital sent her ashes to a P.O. box that didn't exist. And another, I served in Desert Storm. I've been living in my car for 7 years. I heard your story on the radio. It made me believe I wasn't invisible." The room shifted. The tone changed. These were not statistics. These were voices. And Monica was their microphone. "This isn't about my file," she said finally. "It's about the system that let me fall through it. That's letting others fall right now." She leaned forward, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "You're not here to fix my case. Mine's already getting headlines. You're here to make sure there isn't another Monica Carter in 5 years. Or 5 days." For the next hour, she laid out everything: how difficult it had been to access care, how the appeals process dragged on for years, with no communication, how women veterans, especially women of color, were far more likely to be misdiagnosed, underserved, and ignored. She spoke of shelters without space, of benefits that required internet access she didn't have, of bureaucratic cruelty disguised as procedure. And when she was finished, there was silence again. Not defensive, not dismissive, but shaken. One administrator cleared his throat. "We'd like your input, Sergeant Carter," he said carefully, "on restructuring the Veteran Reentry Initiative. You'd have a leadership role paid, of course. You'd help write the protocols, advise on trauma-informed approaches, maybe even chair the advisory council." Monica stared at him, not out of suspicion, but because she had never in her life been offered a seat at the table, let alone the power to build the table itself. Ross gave her a slow nod. "It's yours if you want it," he said softly. Monica leaned back, heart-pounding, eyes burning. She thought of the younger Marines she'd trained, the women who came back broken and ashamed, the men she watched spiral after discharge because they had no one to call. She thought of Jack Parker, the boy she'd pulled through hell and into a helicopter, who'd once called her the spine of the squad. She thought of every night she spent wondering if her life had mattered, and now she knew. It had. Because it was changing others. "I accept," she said, voice steady. "But I'm not here to play nice. I'm here to make noise. And I won't be polite about it." Some of them smiled. Others shifted uncomfortably. All of them took her seriously. As they left the building, Ross looked at her with a kind of reverence she hadn't yet grown used to. "You just changed policy, Monica." She shrugged. "About damn time." That evening, she returned to her hotel and opened her laptop, a gift from a nonprofit the day before, and stared at the blinking cursor on a blank page. Her inbox was flooded. Journalists, veterans, students, survivors. They wanted her story, her guidance, her strength. She opened a new message addressed to Olivia. The subject line read, Jack. And in the body, just one sentence. He gave me a mission, I'm finally ready to finish it. She hit send, then sat in the quiet with tears in her eyes, not of pain, but of release. For the first time in years, Monica Carter did not feel forgotten. She felt summoned, and she was ready. The next morning broke with a quiet kind of promise, the kind that didn't announce itself with headlines or fanfare, but whispered through early light and calm skies that something had shifted subtly but permanently, and Monica Carter felt it in her bones, before her feet even touched the floor. She had always believed that the smallest decisions often led to the greatest reckonings, the decision to turn left instead of right to speak, instead of remain silent to endure one more day when your body begged for surrender. Now, for the first time in years, her every move felt like it carried weight, not the burden of surviving unnoticed, but the deliberate gravity of someone seen, someone needed. Her phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. It was a message from Ross VA Board approved the first 5 reforms this morning. You're already being quoted in Senate subcommittee hearings. I'll brief you after lunch. Also, CBS wants a full interview, and the Washington Post's editorial team wants to run your speech in print, unedited. Monica blinked, sat up, and stared at the text as if it were written in another language. Her story, once a life no one noticed, was becoming a blueprint, a weapon, a mirror. Still, she made no rush to answer. She dressed slowly, methodically, slipping on the same blazer she wore at the panel, pinning the Navy Cross above her heart, not for vanity, but for memory. Every medal on her chest was a name, a battle, a scar, some healed, some not, and she wasn't about to let people forget that. Outside, the city moved around her buses, screeching to curbs, interns running in heels across crosswalks, tourists marveling at stone monuments to wars they never knew, and veterans, some in wheelchairs, some in ball caps, stitched with campaign ribbons, nodding at her as she passed those nods, a silent code of recognition, older than any national anthem. When she reached the courthouse steps where she had once stood, shackled and invisible, she paused, looking up, not at the flag waving above the building, but at the people entering and exiting its heavy glass doors. She thought of how many of them were still caught in systems. They didn't understand how many were still being told that their paperwork had been lost. Their suffering was unprovable, their sacrifice not quite enough. And so, instead of continuing to her destination, Monica turned, pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket, and sat down on the top step. Her pen moved without hesitation, not just recounting her own story anymore, but naming the stories that had been entrusted to her letters from widows in Kansas, discharged single mothers in Atlanta, amputees in Phoenix still waiting for their prosthetics, and one 19-year-old Marine in Idaho who had messaged her simply, "They say I'm strong, but I'm scared. Your story made me believe I might still have a chance." She wrote for 2 hours in the cold. Then she stood, walked to the Capitol offices, and dropped the notebook now filled with names, testimonies, and raw truth on the desk of the newly appointed Veterans Affairs Oversight Director. "They trusted me with these," she told the startled aide. "Now you don't get to look away." The aide nodded, her throat tight, and Monica left without another word. That afternoon she returned to the National Veterans Hall, not as a speaker, not as a guest, but as a founding member of the advisory board that would help reshape national veteran policy from the inside. The other board members, decorated officers, and retired legal minds looked up as she entered, their expressions a blend of respect and caution. She sat down at the table's edge, pulled her binder open, and began listing initiatives not yet discussed: transitional housing for female vets with PTSD mobile therapy units for rural towns, mental health liaisons embedded at discharge checkpoints, and a national Lost Valor recovery team designed to track and return medals, records, and identities to those whom the system had let vanish. "These aren't suggestions," she said plainly, her voice low but unshakable. "These are obligations. We've already taken too long to act." One older colonel across from her, slow to speak but sharper than he looked, leaned in and said, "Sergeant Carter, are you proposing we rewrite the framework from the ground up?" She met his gaze without blinking. "No," she said. "I'm saying the old framework didn't work. We're not rewriting it, we're replacing it." A hush fell over the room. Not resistance, not dismissal, but something new: consensus. And in that silence, Monica saw a window opening. Later that week, she received a call from a university professor who specialized in ethics and military history. "We'd like to invite you to speak to our incoming law students," the woman said. "We believe they need to hear not just about justice as theory, but justice as a living, breathing fight, one fought by people like you." Monica hesitated. Academia had never been her world, but then again, neither had courts or microphones or stages. She said yes. And 2 weeks later, standing before a packed auditorium of future prosecutors, defenders, and judges, she didn't speak about war. She spoke about silence. About the silence that crept in after discharge, the silence of forms unanswered, of nights unsheltered, of the ache that came not just from injury, but from irrelevance. The law, she told them, is not just what's written. It's what you choose to see, and what you choose to ignore. When she finished, no one moved for a long time. That evening, as Monica walked alone through the quiet campus grounds, the wind tugged gently at her coat, and above her, the flag at the center courtyard flew beneath a half moon. She looked up at it, remembering the way Jack had saluted the flag the morning he deployed, the sharpness in his arm, the quiet confidence in his face. "You didn't die alone, Jack," she whispered, "and I didn't disappear." And somewhere in that moment, in that breath beneath a pale sky and a remembered salute, Monica Carter finally let herself believe what everyone else had already begun to understand. She had become a lighthouse, and the world was turning toward her light. The news spread quietly at first, a few headlines buried beneath the week's political noise. Homeless veteran becomes architect of reform from forgotten to founder. Staff Sergeant Monica Carter redefines post-service care. But then the larger networks caught on, and soon Monica's name wasn't just being whispered among veteran circles or advocacy groups. It was on national broadcasts, on evening panels, and in classrooms where students who had never heard of Fallujah were now writing papers titled "The Carter Initiative: How One Voice Changed the System." Monica didn't seek the spotlight. In fact, it often made her uneasy the way people now looked at her, with a reverence that bordered on myth, the way reporters clung to her every word, as if her entire life had been leading to this. But she reminded herself each morning, as she ran her hand across the still new surface of her kitchen table, that the attention wasn't hers alone. It belonged to every vet whose name was lost in red tape, every mother who received folded flags but no answers, every friend who didn't survive long enough to see the policy changes their suffering had demanded. It was for them, always them. And so, even as she remained grounded in humility, she used every second of visibility as a weapon against complacency. Within months, the Carter Standards became federal recommendations. No discharge without a verified benefits brief. Mandatory mental health screening for all veterans regardless of deployment history. National digitization of service records with multi-agency backup. And a sweeping new initiative to identify and rehouse homeless veterans within 90 days of discovery. The hardest battles, though, weren't fought in boardrooms or conference panels. They were fought one-on-one with the people still on the ground, still skeptical, still angry. Monica made it a point to visit shelters and support centers in every state where she had once tried to sleep. In Baltimore, she met an amputee who had served in Syria and now lived beneath a bridge. He refused assistance, convinced it was a trap. She didn't argue. She sat beside him for 2 hours in the cold, sharing stories about MREs and bad jokes from boot camp, until he finally said, "You really were one of us." In New Mexico, she stood in a room of young female veterans too scared to report harassment and said, "You don't owe this country your silence. You gave enough already." And in San Francisco, she found a woman sleeping in the doorway of a VA office, a woman with PTSD dishonorably discharged after a failed drug test, masking a deeper wound. Monica sat on the curb with her and promised, "I'll fight this for you, for all of you." And she did. Behind closed doors, she began compiling the most painful chapter of her advocacy work. The Red Files, a classified list of cases denied, delayed, or discarded, each one reopened under her watch. The program wasn't public yet, but it would be. She made sure of it. Meanwhile, Olivia and Ross remained her steadfast anchors. Olivia, now elevated to a federal judicial appointment, used her growing platform to push through judicial training on trauma-informed bench conduct judges taught to see veterans not as threats, but as survivors. Ross, having turned down 3 promotion offers, expanded his firm's pro bono wing to include a dedicated team for forgotten veteran cases inspired solely by Monica's story. He joked that Monica had turned his life into a full-time revolution. She only smiled. Good. You owed me for that sandwich I couldn't finish behind Jefferson Street Cafe. One night back in her apartment, Monica sat staring at the medals now encased properly on her wall, no longer just symbols, but testimonies. She reached for one letter in particular, Jack's last. The ink faded at the edges. Staff Sergeant Carter isn't like the rest he had written. She doesn't fight for glory. She fights because someone has to. And if I make it home, I'll try to live like she does. Monica read those words again and again, her fingers brushing the page as though it were still warm from his hand. You made it home, Jack, she whispered. I'm just helping others do the same. That week she returned to Fallujah, not the battlefield, but a veterans memorial erected in its honor in Arlington. She brought with her one folded American flag, a worn pair of boots, and the names of the 6 Marines she had carried shielded or lost in that desert. Alone in the early morning light, she placed the items gently at the base of the monument, knelt and said the names aloud, not like a ceremony, but like a promise I haven't stopped fighting. I will never stop. As the wind moved through the trees and whispered through the marble, Monica Carter stood up straighter than she ever had, her silhouette framed by morning sun, her presence a silent force echoing louder than any speech, louder than any honor bestowed upon her. Because the mission wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The next chapter of Monica Carter's mission began not with a law or a speech, but with a whisper, a single name muttered from the edge of a hospital bed, by a man whose face was more scar tissue than skin, whose eyes were clouded with time and morphine, but who, upon seeing her walk into the VA trauma ward in Detroit, whispered with reverence, Carter, you're real. His name was Leonard Tiny Matthews, a former heavy artillery Marine, built like a mountain once, but now barely clinging to the brittle edges of life. A nurse had flagged his case in an internal forum, writing simply, patient refuses end-of-life care until he speaks to someone named Carter, says she saved a convoy and vanished. Monica didn't hesitate. She flew out that same evening, sat by his bedside through the early morning hours, holding his swollen, calloused hand, as he retold a story, broken by gasps and missing years, about the night in 2004, when an ambush shredded their rear guard and a crazy woman, with a busted radio and a sniper's eye, had crawled across 40 meters of live fire to pull him into cover. I didn't know your name then, he said weakly. Just your hands? They were the only steady thing in that chaos. Monica didn't speak. She just squeezed his hand until he closed his eyes and let go. Peace finally replacing the fear that had haunted his last decades. His passing reminded her that justice delayed was still justice denied, especially when it came too late to matter to the person it was owed to. She ordered a full honors burial, for Tiny spoke at his funeral in Michigan and returned to Washington with a sharpened edge. We're running out of time, she told the advisory board that week. For every case we solve, 10 more die waiting. And so, she proposed what would become her boldest idea, yet Project Return Signal, a cross-agency task force of volunteers, investigators, and military record specialists, dedicated to locating lost veterans, reopening unresolved cases, and delivering delayed honors to their families before time made those victories meaningless. At first, government staff balked at the scale, too much manpower, too costly, too ambitious. Monica stared them down and said, "You find the money for tanks, you'll find it for truth." When a senator privately told her it was a long shot, she replied, "Sir, I've been shot at by insurgents in the dark. I can handle a committee." Within 3 months, the pilot program launched in 5 cities. Within 6, it was national. Her own small office in D.C. became its unofficial headquarters where veterans showed up daily, sometimes in wheelchairs, sometimes carrying folders of faded discharge papers, telling stories they hadn't told in years. Some cried, some yelled, some simply said, "I'm tired." Monica listened to every single one. One afternoon, a young woman named Deshandra arrived trembling, carrying her dishonorable discharge paperwork and a sealed envelope from her former commanding officer who had since passed away. The letter admitted to a cover-up, an assault-buried retaliation, issued benefits revoked unjustly. Monica read the entire thing word for word, then folded it and told Deshandra, "We're going to burn their silence to the ground." That night, Monica sat alone in her apartment, her living room transformed into a makeshift command center, whiteboards scrawled with policy updates, photos of missing veterans pinned beside timelines and redacted files. Newspaper clippings from protests and editorials, both praising and questioning her sudden rise. On the wall, the Navy Cross gleamed under the lamplight, but Monica rarely looked at it anymore. Not because she didn't honor it, but because she now understood something deeper. True valor wasn't about what you wore on your chest. It was what you carried on your conscience. She glanced down at a new letter, this one from a Gold Star father in Georgia. His daughter had died by suicide after returning home, her VA claim still pending 2 years later. I just want someone to say her name, the father had written. To remember she mattered. Monica didn't write back. Instead, she called him, and she said his daughter's name aloud, again and again, until he cried. And then she cried too. The next day she introduced a new clause into the Veterans Accountability Act. No service death shall be recorded without full recognition of all pending claims and honors, with records permanently amended posthumously if errors are discovered. It passed unanimously. Olivia watched the vote from her office, a silent tear slipping down her cheek, knowing her brother's legacy lived on through the woman who had once been denied warmth behind a cafe. Meanwhile, Ross worked overtime managing the legal infrastructure of Carter's crusade, refusing every press request, every interview. When asked why he stayed behind the scenes, he always answered the same way. Because she's the voice. I'm just the echo. That winter, Monica was invited to deliver the keynote speech at Arlington's National Day of Remembrance. She wore her uniform that day, not out of formality, but out of fire. Her speech was short. It didn't quote presidents or generals. It quoted a homeless veteran she had met in LA, who once said, "People thank me for my service, but I just want someone to see me when they pass me on the street." Monica paused, then said into the microphone, "We don't honor veterans by building statues. We honor them by building systems that don't forget them." And then she stepped back, saluted the folded flag at her feet, and let silence carry the message further than any anthem ever could. That evening, walking alone through the rows of white headstones, she paused at one marked only with a number, no name. "Not anymore," she whispered. Then she pulled a marker from her pocket and wrote one word across the temporary plaque, "Seen," because that was the promise now. No more forgotten, no more nameless, no more left behind, not on her watch, not while she was still breathing. The following spring arrived not with fanfare, but with subtle shifts, the kind Monica Carter had learned to recognize after a lifetime of paying attention to what others ignored, the way the morning sun lingered just a second longer on the sidewalk outside her apartment, how the street vendor near the VA headquarters now called her ma'am instead of miss, and how the people who once crossed the street to avoid her presence now crossed it to ask for her advice. Change she had come to realize didn't always roar like a helicopter overhead or crash like artillery. Sometimes it moved like memory, quiet but unrelenting. The Carter Initiative, once considered a fringe effort, had now passed into federal law, with overwhelming bipartisan support. Local governments followed suit, launching regional versions, Carter Center's one-stop outreach, and justice clinics for veterans who had slipped through every safety net. Monica visited the first of these in Chicago, where a woman with burn scars down her left arm ran up to her in tears and said, "You're the reason I filed my claim again. They told me no for years, but you made me believe I could be seen." Monica hugged her tightly, whispering, "You were never invisible. They just refused to look." It wasn't just legislation or brick-and-mortar buildings that marked progress. It was the stories that returned to her inbox every day like prayers from people who had nearly given up, a 67-year-old in New Hampshire whose benefits were finally approved, a young father in Dallas who found housing through a pilot shelter she helped draft, and a teenager in Baltimore who wrote simply, "My mom was a Marine. I thought no one cared about her until I saw your face on the news." Monica read every message, every scrap of testimony, every scanned document of broken systems finally mended. And she never let herself forget that all of this began not in a chamber of power, but behind a cafe, beside a heating vent with half a sandwich and no voice. Ross had taken to calling her the veteran's North Star, a name she initially rolled her eyes at, but had slowly come to accept, not because she felt worthy of the metaphor, but because she understood its weight, constant present, unblinking. Olivia, now serving as a federal judge on the highest veterans circuit in the country, had begun citing Monica's testimony in rulings that overturned decades of precedent. One such case involved a Marine dishonorably discharged in 1996 for mental health symptoms that had only recently been diagnosed as combat-related PTSD. The moment Olivia cited Carter vs. Department of Veterans Affairs on record, it sent a legal shockwave across the nation. That night, Monica called her. "You made Jack proud," Olivia whispered. "No," Monica replied, voice tight with quiet fire. "Jack made me possible." Their friendship, once born from coincidence and grief, had evolved into something both fierce and sacred, a quiet alliance between women who had lost too much but refused to let that loss define them. Monica had started carrying Jack's last letter in her breast pocket again, not out of sentiment, but as armor. She no longer felt guilt over the time she'd bought him, only gratitude that those 2 weeks had given him the chance to write those words to live with dignity, to inspire the very legacy she now carried forward. On the anniversary of his death, Monica returned to the Parker family home, where Olivia's elderly parents greeted her at the porch with tears in their eyes and warm tea in their hands. They handed her a framed photograph never before shown to the public. Jack and Monica, shoulder to shoulder, snapped by a fellow Marine the night before deployment, both laughing at something long forgotten. "He didn't laugh much after that," Olivia's mother said, "but he always did around you." Monica stared at the photo for a long time, then whispered, "We all carry someone." That phrase would later become the slogan of the nationwide Carter Memorial Scholarship, awarded annually to veterans turned advocates who had shown leadership in fields of justice medicine and reform. Still, for all the national acclaim, Monica stayed rooted in the places others ignored. She often rode public buses to distant VA clinics without security or press, sitting beside elderly men in camouflage ball caps and younger women with fatigue in their eyes. She didn't need them to recognize her, she just needed them to feel that someone like them still existed, still fought, still breathed. One day, while walking the edge of a park in Baltimore, she spotted a group of teenage boys taunting an elderly black man in a wheelchair outside a shelter. The man's hands were shaking. His medals were pinned to his coat, dulled with age ignored. Monica stepped between them, without hesitation, her voice a controlled whisper edged in steel. "Walk away. Now." The boys hesitated, then scattered. The man looked up at her with wide, glassy eyes. "They said I was lying," he murmured, "that no woman could be a real Marine, that I made it all up." Monica knelt beside him. "Then let them lie. You already lived the truth." He clutched her hand, tears streaming silently. That night, Monica wrote a column titled, "What We Wear Isn't Just Fabric, It's History." It went viral. Days later, Congress passed a motion to require historical training on women and minority veteran contributions in all federal onboarding programs. When asked to comment, Monica said, "Only, you can't serve what you don't remember." But perhaps the moment that moved her most came in the form of a simple knock. It was late. She had just returned from a forum in Kansas City. Her coat was still damp from rain. When she opened the door, she found Jimmy, the same cafe worker who once left sandwiches near the vent, standing there with a worn brown bag. "I made you something," he said. Inside was a loaf of homemade cornbread, still warm. "You told me once I helped keep you alive, but you've helped keep us all going." Monica pulled him into a hug, the kind that says you were there when no one else was, and whispered, "I never forgot." They sat for hours not as hero and civilian, but as two people who had seen the best and worst of humanity and chose to keep giving anyway. As midnight approached, Monica stood at the window, staring out at the quiet city. In her hand was a letter unsigned, postmarked from a rural town, typed in plain black ink. It read, "I tried to end my life last week. I didn't go through with it because I heard your story on the radio. You don't know me, but you saved me. I'm going to try again tomorrow, not to die, but to live." Monica folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a small box marked, "Why I Keep Going." Inside it were hundreds more scraps of hope stitched together by one unyielding truth, that when the world had forgotten them, she had not. And as she turned off the light and let the city sleep, Monica Carter whispered to the dark, "We're not finished yet." And somewhere, someone halfway across the country, sitting in silence with their own war scars and waiting for morning, felt seen, felt heard, felt worth surviving. Monica Carter didn't realize how much time had passed until she looked at the calendar taped beside her kitchen wall. A hand-drawn grid covered with color-coded ink strokes, reminders, initials, flight paths, initials of survivors she had promised to meet. Initials of lawmakers she had cornered into signing reform bills, and tiny stars beside the names of veterans whose cases had finally been resolved after decades of silence. The dates blurred together, not because she was tired, though she was, but because she had become the kind of woman for whom the passage of time no longer served as measurement, only as momentum. It had been nearly a year since she turned down the Presidential Medal of Freedom and asked that the money be used to fund trauma recovery beds in rural counties. Since then, her days had evolved from meetings and keynotes to relentless ground-level work, late-night phone calls with desperate families, appeals filed on the back of napkins when no printer could be found, hospital visits with vets who had no one else to sit with them through the morphine drips and the quiet shame of being remembered too late. But on this morning, something felt different. Her phone buzzed only once, a rare silence. Outside the streets of D.C., where quiet under early spring rain, the kind that softened pavement and pulled scents from trees before the season turned to fire, Monica stepped out onto her balcony, a simple cement slab with rusting edges, and looked across the skyline of a city she had once feared would bury her, and now trusted her to help shape its conscience. Her reflection in the glass door startled her, not because of the aging lines or silver near her temples, but because of how steady she looked. For years she had fought with the posture of someone who might collapse at any second. Now her shoulders held stories, not weight. She opened her inbox slowly, not wanting to be pulled into the urgency of 100 lives before she found time to feel the one she had built. Near the top sat a message flagged urgent but marked with a name she hadn't seen in decades. Private First Class Haley Rojas, 2005 Kandahar. The name ripped through her memory like shrapnel. Haley had been barely 20 when she was deployed, full of questions and righteous defiance, but kind to the core, the kind of soldier who wrote poetry between patrols and carved birds out of ration boxes to leave on bunks. Monica opened the message. It wasn't from Haley, but from her daughter. Dear Sergeant Carter, I found your name in my mother's deployment journal. She said if I was ever lost, truly lost, and she couldn't help me, I should find you. I'm 17 now. She passed last year from cancer. I've been in and out of group homes ever since. I'm not sure why I'm writing, but I didn't know who else might care. Monica didn't wait. She canceled her day called Ross to cover the afternoon legal panel and boarded the next train to Pennsylvania, where the girl lived. By the time she arrived, it was dusk. The group home was run down, but passable staff underpaid, overworked, the kind who smiled too quickly and looked past pain as a survival mechanism. Monica found the girl Elena sitting alone in the back courtyard, hoodie up knees to her chest. When Monica approached, Elena didn't flinch. I thought maybe you'd show up, she said softly. She said you never ignored people. Monica crouched beside her. She was right. They sat for nearly an hour in silence before Elena spoke again. She told me you saved her, that you got her out after that night with the bombing, but she never said what it cost you. Monica stared at the concrete beneath their feet. We all paid something. The trick is figuring out how to make the cost count. Elena turned to her. Do you think I count? The question sliced through Monica harder than any bullet she'd ever dodged. She answered with no hesitation. You do now. You always did. I just needed to get to you in time. That night, Monica called Olivia and said, we need to expand Carter Centers to include children of veterans. They're the next ones being forgotten. Olivia, without pause, replied, already drafting it. In the months that followed, Monica didn't slow down. She accelerated. Her personal team tripled in size. She created mobile units that traveled to the most remote regions of America, places where broadband didn't exist, but military trauma did. She set up helplines where real humans answered instead of machines. She funded therapy collectives for trans veterans, indigenous veterans, and Vietnamese American interpreters who had been denied green cards after service. And everywhere she went, she asked the same question. Who did we leave behind this time? One day in a meeting with federal contractors, a young analyst asked her bluntly, how long do you plan to keep doing this? Monica blinked, then leaned forward. Until every grave is marked, every name is restored, and every one of us is allowed to come home in full, not in pieces. Later that week, she received a letter from Dana Hill's care home, the woman she had pulled from the void months earlier. The letter read, Dana passed peacefully last night. She asked for her boots to be buried with her, and she was holding a photo of you. Monica wept in the hallway of the Carter Center for the first time in public, and no one stopped her. No one tried to hush it. They let the woman who had carried everyone finally cry for herself. In her next address to Congress, Monica didn't wear her uniform or her medals. She wore a plain black dress, no insignia, and said only this: "I am not here to represent strength. I am here to represent memory. And memory isn't always proud. Sometimes it weeps. And we owe it the dignity to do so." The chamber stood. Not out of political obligation, but out of something deeper. Because they knew she was not done. She was becoming history, and she was writing it while still alive. The day Monica Carter retired didn't come with fanfare medals or public declarations. It arrived quietly like the sunrise over Arlington, slow and sure, marking not an ending, but a threshold. She had spent nearly 15 years transforming policy into protection speeches, into shelter legislation, into lives restored. And now, at 73, with her body growing heavier in places where memory had lived too long, she finally allowed herself the grace to step aside, not out of exhaustion, but out of trust. Because the system she once had to drag forward with bleeding hands was now running without her push. It was a warm spring afternoon when she walked through the doors of the Carter Veterans Justice Center for the final time as its director. Staff lined the hallway not to clap, but to nod solemn and proud, like soldiers watching a general walk off the battlefield. She wore a simple gray coat, a black scarf, and no makeup. In her hand was the original honor marker plaque she had planted behind Jefferson Street Cafe years ago. On it, only 2 words you mattered. She carried it like a flag. Her desk was empty now, her whiteboard wiped clean, but taped in the corner was the first letter she had ever received from a stranger, a vet in Montana, who wrote, "I heard what you said in court. I didn't kill myself that night because of it." She folded the letter once more and slid it into her breast pocket beside Jack's last note. Outside, waiting on the front steps, stood Olivia Parker, now Chief Justice of the Veterans Appeals Circuit, and Ross, now gray at the temples and still refusing to write a book about any of it. With them were 300 veterans from 50 states, some in uniform, some in street clothes, all standing in a silent semicircle. No speeches, no cameras, just presence. Monica stepped into the middle and took a long, deep breath. "We did what we said we would do," she said softly. "We didn't leave anyone behind." From the crowd, a young man barely 20 with fresh discharge papers in his back pocket and a tremble in his lip stepped forward. "Ma'am, my mom said you saved her life when I was a baby. She said I wouldn't be here without you." Monica walked over to him, touched his shoulder and said, "Then live boldly. So it means something." She handed him the plaque. "Put this somewhere, someone will see it." That night in her apartment overlooking the Potomac, Monica sat alone with a single candle burning beside the letters, medals, and framed photographs that marked decades of service, but her eyes weren't on the past. They were on a handwritten list in her lap, the names of 10 young advocates across the country she had personally mentored, each now running Carter Center's outreach initiatives and legislative desks, her successors, her legacy living and breathing and still in motion. Outside, the city glowed gold and quiet. The Jefferson Street Cafe had been renovated into a cooperative staffed by formerly homeless veterans. Every table bore a brass nameplate. One simply read, "Monica sat here to stay warm. Now, we stay warm because of her." Around midnight, she made one final call. It wasn't to a senator or a network. It was to Elena Rojas, now 27 now, a lawyer now director of the Veterans Advocacy Clinic in Denver. "You ready?" Monica asked. "More than ready," Elena said. "You taught me how to carry the weight," good Monica whispered. "Then it's yours now." After hanging up, she stepped out onto her balcony one last time. The breeze was soft and the city no longer loomed over her. She thought of Jack, of Dana, of Jimmy, of every name etched into the quiet corners of her heart, those who had been forgotten, but never truly lost. She closed her eyes and said into the night, "I remember you. All of you." And in that silence filled not with absence but with fulfillment, Monica Carter let go not of the mission, but of the burden. She had kept her promise. She had carried them all the way home. Some heroes don't wear capes. They wear scars. They sit in silence on freezing sidewalks waiting for someone, anyone to remember their name. Monica Carter didn't seek glory. She sought justice not for herself, but for every voice drowned in paperwork, every soul left to sleep in shadows, every story buried behind bureaucracy. She rose from a bench in a courtroom, not to demand redemption, but to become it for a nation that nearly lost its conscience. And in doing so, she showed us all what real leadership looks like, not power, not perfection, but presence. In the end, she didn't need medals. Her greatest honor was this when someone whispered, "I survived," because of her. Let her story remind us no one should ever be left behind, not while we are still breathing. If her journey moved, you share it, remember her, and carry someone forward.